What I thought I'd do is just start out with a little bit about how I got involved in this movement to rehumanize mental health, this sort of human rights movement really is what it is, for informed choice. I never really even knew there was a movement until 1994, and I'll talk about it a little bit later about how I discovered it. But really, for several years prior to 1994, I had become increasingly alienated, really even embarrassed from the direction of the whole mental health profession, psychiatry and psychology, which I saw as becoming increasingly authoritarian. And I'm going to be using these words authoritarian, anti-authoritarian a couple of times. I see a lot of head shakes when I said increasingly authoritarian. But let me just tell you how the way I use that word, authoritarian, by that I mean just an unquestioning obedience to authority, regardless of the merits of authority, okay? Regardless of whether the authority knows what they're talking about or is being honest, just an unquestioning obedience. And anti-authoritarian means, for me, that you don't take all authority seriously. You assess whether the authority knows what they're talking about, whether they're legitimate or not legitimate. And if you assess them to be not legitimate, illegitimate, you challenge that authority. You resist that authority. That's an anti-authoritarian. And so the mental health profession that I went into, that I got excited about, even before I became an undergraduate in psychology, was much more anti-authoritarian, okay? It was much more a profession that it was part of, it was believed that what we were supposed to do in the whole mental health field was to question whether authorities out there who were legitimate or not legitimate institutions. And so you had in that, you had things like in the 1960s, the Milgram studies, which I'm sure hopefully are still being taught to psychology majors, where you had questions which was about obedience to authority, and it became where people were the subjects were complying to illegitimate authorities, and it concerned an entire society that a majority of subjects would do things because they were coerced and intimidated by illegitimate authorities. So you had a climate also in the society in general, but in psychology, of people worried about compliance much more than they were worried about non-compliance. And then you take a look in psychology and psychiatry, how not only was there anti-authoritarianism, there was successful anti-authoritarianism. And I'll just give you a couple examples from the realm of diagnoses. Again, before I even become a psychology major, I'm still in high school, and you have within the realm of diagnosis, you had gay activists protested at the American Psychiatric Association, saying that the idea that homosexuality was a mental illness was not valid. And they protested this, and they were successful. It was a successful challenge. American Psychiatric Association eliminated homosexuality as a mental illness in the 1970s. Also, you had challenges to the whole capacity of psychiatry to reliably diagnose, even reliably diagnose serious mental illness. So one of the most famous studies of that time, again, by the time I was an undergraduate in psychology in the middle 70s, was in all the intro psychology textbooks, was a study called Being Sane in Insane Places by David Rosenhan. And if you've not heard of it, just a 1-minute version of that study was he sent several pseudo-patients to a bunch of different mental hospitals, and he told them to pretend that they were hearing vague, hollow voices. That was the symptom, vague, hollow voices, and all of them were admitted into the psychiatric hospital. That wasn't really the big story, that they were able to fool psychiatry. Okay, the big story was that all of these patients immediately after they got admitted started acting as normally as they could, and all their fellow patients in the hospital knew that they were part of an experiment. But psychiatrists there refused to admit they were wrong, refused to release them, and they all stayed on average 19 days before they got out. Some of them were there close to 2 months. And when they were released all with the diagnosis of schizophrenia in remission. And this was a big story, widely known, embarrassed the American Psychiatric Association, embarrassed establishment psychiatry, to the point where they said, we have to try to come up with some kind of manual that will reliably diagnose things better, okay? So it was a successful anti-authoritarian challenge. All right, so I become a psychology major in the 70s, go off to graduate school. And I'm in graduate school between 1978 and 1985, getting my master's, getting my PhD, ultimately become a licensed clinical psychologist. But by the 1980s, from my point of view, the whole field, just really like the rest of society, and that's a whole other issue, is becoming more authoritarian. And I'll give you a couple examples, again, just sticking with the realm of diagnoses. You had In 1980, DSM-3 comes out, and the American Psychiatric Association informs America that we now have a reliable diagnostic tool because we have these behavioral checklists in this new tool. They just say that. I, as a student in graduate school, looking at it, I'm going, is this really more reliable? I mean, there's still diagnoses are not made on any objective measure like blood tests or brain scans or EEGs. It's based on words, okay? And for me, it was obvious as an undergraduate in my 20s. I mean, as a graduate student, it was like obvious. Words are very subjective. I mean, what depressed mood means one thing to one person. Unhappy, it means these things are highly subjective. And also, too, people behave differently around people differently. So kids especially, if they respect some authority, they could be very compliant and they could be very respectful. If they don't, they could be obnoxious. So there was no, I doubted this thing was really going to make things more reliable. And then by the 1990s, there were lots of studies that showed this was not really any more reliable a tool than any other. You could take a look at works by guys like Stuart Kirk and Cutchins. And, you know, they finally the studies were done, but people were just accepting this. The American Psychiatric Association announced this is a more reliable tool. We've solved the problem of reliability, and nobody was saying really. And then the other thing too, just take a look at validity of diagnoses. When that DSM-3 came out in 1980, yes, homosexuality was no longer in it. But included in there were a lot more childhood diagnoses. Okay, so that's where oppositional defiant disorder came in to the DSM. And again, as a graduate student, I'm looking at this thing called oppositional defiant disorder, and the symptoms often argue with adults, often refuse to comply with adults. And I'm going, this is a mental illness? I mean, I could see why these kids are, going to create some tension. Maybe they're a handful for authorities. But is this really a mental illness? And here's the thing. I remember clearly being in my graduate school era, fellow graduate students, also hanging out with a lot of psychiatry residents in my different placements, and they were all chuckling at this. But nobody was really speaking loud truths to power. It was like just throwing these kids under a bus. And then eventually these kids who were being labeled with oppositional defiant disorder would be medicated. And if you take a look at the majority of people being put on antipsychotics nowadays, especially kids, they don't have any psychotic diagnosis. They have these disruptive behavioral disorder diagnoses. And so, I was sensing all that. And then if you take a look at the realm of just in psychiatry, you see how in the 1970s it was very acceptable to be an anti-authoritarian psychiatrist and rise to great power. Okay, so for example, for me, a great example of that is Loren Moshe, who I'm sure some of you have heard of. He was the creator of Soteria House, right? And in the 1970s, here's this guy who rises to power in the National Institute of Mental Health, the director of the Center for Schizophrenia Studies. I mean, this is a huge, powerful position. And he takes a look at the data, plus his own personal experience, and he comes to the conclusion these hospitalizations for people who have had psychotic breaks are not working great. Let's come up with something else. Okay, let's try something different. He challenges the authority, and he comes up with the Soteria House, this basically a respite house, very completely different than hospitalization, and it works great. Okay, so what happens to Loren Moshe? By 1980, he's fired. He's just fired. And so this is what happens in psychology, psychiatry. By the time the 1980s comes around, you have a kind of squashing of a lot of anti-authoritarian behavior that had once been part of the profession that I went into. So again, needless to say, I was increasingly embarrassed, increasingly alienated. By the time I get my PhD in 1985, I'm seriously thinking of quitting this profession. And really, if I had some great option at the time, I might well have. But I go get my PhD, get licensed, and I then just go off in private practice and just really sort of embarrassed by the profession. But I'm not working in any kind of institutional life, any hospitals or clinics. And so I can do a lot of really what I want to do in private practice. But by the time the 90s come around, the expansionism of diagnoses, the more medicating, especially of kids who I think are just acting well within the normal range, and not only are they not now getting pathologized, but they're getting medicated, I'm so embarrassed that I feel like I have to speak out more. And so I start to publish things. So 1994, the year I mentioned before, something that I get published is spotted by a guy named David Oakes. As some of you might know David, back then he was director of something called Support Coalition. International, which sort of morphed into Mind Freedom. And David, back then in 1994, he just telephones me. This was pre-email. We actually had a phone conversation. And he identified himself as a psychiatric survivor. I had never heard that term before. I didn't know what he was talking about. He explained it. And then he said to me, "You're a dissident psychologist." And I had never heard that term before. To this day, David says he helped my self-esteem because he knew I was embarrassed being a psychologist, so he gave me that. So he claims therapy on me. I guess he's right, you know. So anyways, that's when I started to learn about this movement. So I started to go to some conferences, okay, where people, I met other folks in the psychiatric survivors, became my friends, people who were dissident professionals, also documentary filmmakers and artists, journalists who were sympathetic to the movement. And one of the things that was really clear to me was how different this group of people was than the majority of people I went to school with. The graduate students I went to school with, the psychiatry residents, they were so different in the sense of being anti-authoritarian, in the sense of being comfortable speaking truth to power, questioning before complying. It really divided this group up, okay? And so I felt like, wow, this is the tribe I belong in. And this is like, and so that's how I ended up in this movement, okay? And again, what is this movement? As I said before, this movement at one level is certainly about a human rights movement for informed choice and mental health. But I think at another level, all right, at a deeper level maybe, this movement is part of a greater movement in American society that opposes authoritarianism, okay? That opposes coercion. It opposes illegitimate authorities trying to get us to be something that we're not, okay? And I think, therefore, this movement is part of a greater movement for democracy, okay? And by democracy, I mean genuine democracy. I always have to use that because democracy does not mean getting to vote in elections between lesser of two evil candidates. I mean, that is, totalitarian societies have that kind of thing. Genuine democracy means that you really have power over important aspects of your life, including healthcare. So for me, this movement is part of a general movement in American society to take power back, away from illegitimate authorities and to individuals and communities. All right? At least that's how I see this movement. And we could talk about it later in the discussion period. I'd be glad to hear what other people, how they view this movement, or if they even know that there is a movement. But what I want to get into here is, what I want to talk about here today, mostly, is three areas, okay? Three related areas. And the first area has to do with how in recent years, establishment psychiatry has really lost massive amounts of credibility, okay? Even as reported by the mainstream media, right? And by establishment psychiatry, I certainly mean the American Psychiatric Association, psychiatry departments, these thought leaders, all of these folks who've taken massive amounts of money from drug companies. I'm going to get into that. And they have lost so much credibility that what I'm going to get into here is that people like the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, very politically astute guy who worries about his place in history, has distanced himself, has tried to separate himself out from that. And a lot of the American public is not aware of this kind of stuff that's going on. Even some once establishment psychiatry people have become apostates, okay? And so I'm going to get into that. The second thing that I want to talk about is that despite this massive loss of credibility by establishment psychiatry, they still persist as an institution. Okay, they still have major influence. So I want to talk about why is that? What is going on in our society, in our culture? What's going on politically? Which brings me to the third area that I want to talk about, which is what else can we do in terms of advocacy and in terms of activism beyond getting the truth out there. Because it seems for me that the truth alone has not been enough to set us free from certain kinds of oppression. More is required. So the first area is about this loss of credibility in psychiatry. Four major areas, okay, that the mainstream media actually has been reporting over the several years. First area, okay, has to do with the corruption of psychiatry by drug companies. Right, and this really started to happen. Mainstream media started to report this in 2008. They've known about it for many, many years. but they were afraid until the US Congress, until the US Senate investigated psychiatry back in 2008. And then one story after another in the mainstream media about, for example, Joseph Biederman, Harvard psychiatrist, who was really the force behind pediatric bipolar disorder. And they report $1.6 million from Biederman from drug companies over a 6-year period. Charles Nemiroff from Emory, $2.8 million. Alan Schatzberg, former president of the American Psychiatric Association, $4.8 million in drug company stock holdings, okay? You have the American Psychiatric Association itself, that Congress finds out that they, of their $62 million budget, 30% of it is from drug companies. So all of these things, one big thought leader psychiatrist, one major institution after another, is now out there in the mainstream. So for a guy like me, when I talk now about the corruption of psychiatry by drug company, this is not a radical, controversial thing. I can reference, hyperlink, whatever, to mainstream media. So that's one big area. Second area, okay, where establishment psychiatry has lost massive amount of credibility is in terms of the biochemical brain imbalance theory of mental illness. Now, those of us who are in this movement that I talked about for many years, certainly going back to the 1990s, knew that there was lots of research out there that showed that this was not true. There was no such thing as a biochemical brain imbalance, theory. There was a theory, but there was not a fact. We knew this stuff, but what happened was this stuff kept on being promulgated by drug companies and commercials, by establishment psychiatry, okay? And then, to the point where by 2006, if you look at polls, 80% of Americans thought that depression was caused by low levels of serotonin, okay? More thought so for when you're talking about schizophrenia. The percentage is even higher in terms of chemical brain imbalance theory. All right, so what happens? By 2007, something really interesting happened. Just about the point where I'm getting my depression book published, The Surviving America's Depression Epidemic, Thomas Insel, who I'll bring up this guy a lot, who's the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, longtime director, just recently retired, who's a very politically astute guy, worried about his place in history. He knows that there's no facts behind this chemical brain imbalance theory. In 2007, he tells Newsweek that depression is caused by an underproduction of serotonin or any neurotransmitter. It's just not true. But he doesn't quite come out and say this chemical brain imbalance theory is just BS. That happens though, later. 2011, one of the most interesting blogs out of something called the Psychiatric Times, one of your most major establishment psychiatry journals. A guy who's the editor emeritus of the Psychiatric Times, a guy named Ronald Pease. He says in this blog, and this is almost an exact quote, that no well-informed psychiatrist has ever believed in the chemical brain imbalance theory of mental illness. And he calls it urban legend. That's what he calls it, urban legend, which for me is BS. I mean, that's what he's calling it. And the interesting sort of, for me, bizarre thing about this is he claims that the reason it's out there has nothing to do with psychiatry. It has to do with drug companies and also those critics of psychiatry who falsely attribute it to psychiatry, which is, for me, bizarre. If you look at, there's so much documentation. If you look at Robert Whitaker's last book, Under the Psychiatry Under Influence, he has tons of documentation that establishment psychiatry was talking about this chemical brain imbalance theory. The other thing that really happened that was real interesting for our movement was in 2012, National Public Radio, NPR, a reporter there, her name is Elise Spiegel. Turns out, when she was a teenager, she was depressed, and her parents, like many other parents in America, are concerned, and they took her to Johns Hopkins, where you would think there would be well-informed psychiatrists at Johns Hopkins. But they tell Spiegel and her parents exactly what most people are hearing in America, that you have this chemical brain imbalance which can be corrected by SSRI drugs. Well, Spiegel, when she becomes an adult and a journalist with NPR, she goes and investigates. She talks to all of those researchers who long before said no, there's no connection here. And she gets a little upset, so she writes a story about this. And so nowadays, when guys like me talk about the chemical imbalance theory, not being true, being hoax, urban legend, BS, whatever you want to call it, that I can connect now, reference, hyperlink to mainstream media because it's finally gotten out there. It took a long time. A third area where establishment psychiatry has lost massive amount of credibility, as reported by the mainstream, has to do with the effectiveness of their drugs. We'll stick with effectiveness for now. Safety is a whole other big issue, but just effectiveness. If you take a look at antidepressants, again, those of us in this movement have known for many, many years, going way back, that these newer SSRI drugs, which came out on the market in the late 1980s, first were Prozac, then Paxil, Zoloft, we knew that they were that effective. Study after study showed they weren't much effective than the older antidepressants, just different side effects. But they were advertised as this miracle drug. We knew in the movement, certainly by the early 2000s, about Irving Kirsch's work. Irving Kirsch, again, the 30-second version, if you've never heard of Irving Kirsch's stuff, he used the Freedom of Information Act to go to the FDA and to get published and unpublished studies on all antidepressants studies that had been done and registered, but not some of them not published. And he found that if you took a look overall at all these studies, the antidepressants failed to outperform the placebos in the majority of trials. And this was in drug company dice-loaded study, too. Okay, so this was a big deal. Media is not really reporting it. Then what happens is Kirsch gets himself appointed to Harvard. And I guess that's good enough for 60 Minutes, because in 2012, there's this whole segment on 60 Minutes about Irving Kirsch. And again, the politically astute director of the National Institute of Mental Health, he must have knew about this coming, that it was going to hit the air. And so what he said in 2011 might be interesting for you. I got a couple of quotes from him. 2011, he says about antidepressants, the bottom line is that these antidepressants appear to have a relatively small effect in patients broadly classified as having depression. Next, probably the biggest U-turn, the biggest 180 has to do with the effectiveness of antipsychotic medication. And this is really remarkable, and it all really begins with Robert Whitaker's Anatomy of an Epidemic that comes out in 2010, where you have Whitaker, who's an investigative journalist, uncovering this study called the Martin Harrow study out of the University of Illinois. And it's sort of a very sad commentary on American society that you needed to have an investigative journalist uncover this. Every psychologist should have known about this without that uncovering. But it had been buried. And so he uncovers this study, which had done, again, the short version of it is, he took a look at longitudinally, naturalistically, a large group of people who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he just followed them up over 20 years. And he took a look at them at 5-year intervals. And what he discovered was that overall, those people who on their own went off their medication, okay, those people, they ended up having much better outcomes than the people who stayed on their medication. About 30% on their own just went off their medication. And they had less relapses, they were working more, they had less anxiety on almost every criteria. Of course, when this comes out, establishment psychiatry just dismisses it out of hand. This is a naturalistic longitudinal study. We need to see a randomized design. We're not going to take anything seriously. So what ends up happening is, though, that they don't know that there's a randomized design study in the works that comes out in 2013 that says exactly the same thing. It's a Dutch study. And what happens is again, he took this guy who did it, Wunderink is his name, he divided a group of people who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia into two groups, on medication, non-medication, and the folks who were not on medication, 7 years later, they were doing more than twice as well in terms of not relapsing, having been in more work positions, having more friends, every criteria. So when this happens, okay, something really interesting happens again at the National Institute of Mental Health. Again, Thomas Insel, who again wants to have his place in history, not look like he's a fool, he's a bozo, he comes out in 2013 and he says this, quoting the Harrow study, quoting the Wunderink study, he says about people diagnosed with schizophrenia this: for some people, remaining on medication long-term might impede a full return to wellness. This is shocking turnaround. All right? He's not saying for everybody, he's not anti-medication, but he's just making the statement. Look at the research there. For some people, it might impede their full return to wellness, and we have a lot of documentation of this. Okay, so again, once he says that, now a guy like me can publish this anywhere. I write for mainstream media, I write for independent media, I write for alternative media. I could not get these studies published before the director of the National Institute of Mental Health says this, and then I could get it published in places like the Huffington Post. So I have articles about this in there. Last area, okay, where they've lost a massive amount of credibility has to do with the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual. Again, those of us who are in this movement known for years that this has very little to do, almost nothing to do with science, this thing called the DSM. It's how do behaviors become a mental illness? Well, a committee at the American Psychiatric Association sits around and they decide what behaviors make them real uncomfortable and what behaviors are going to make a lot of Americans uncomfortable, and they get stamped mental illness. And it turns out that the majority of those people on that committee have financial ties to drug companies. So we've known this. Well, where is the science behind this stuff at all? Okay, so what happens though is a really interesting thing, and I've been talking about this in the basic realm of activism for years. When people get hopeless about things not happening, is one of the things to keep in mind is if you take a look at history, whenever you have really expansionistic or institutions, imperialistic nation states, if always in history they go too far, because with their successful expansionism, DSM-1 getting two bigger than 1, 3 bigger than 2, 4 bigger than 3, what happens is that they get arrogant and they don't realize there's a line where if they go over, there's going to be blowback. And that's what happens in 2012 and 2013 with DSM-5. By 2012, major establishment psychiatrists who are really politically astute know how embarrassing the expansionism in this thing is going to be. So probably the most famous guy in this category would be a guy named Alan Francis, who was task force director of DSM-4. You can't be more of an establishment psychiatrist than this guy. But he knew that in DSM-5, they were going to now pathologize grief. That if you were grieving the most important person in your life for more than 2 weeks, depression diagnosis, antidepressants you're going to get put on. And there were other diagnoses too. So he ends up railing against this stuff, writing this book called Saving Normal. And because he's an apostate psychiatrist, this is big news for mainstream media like the New York Times. So there's lots of stories about him. And of course, Thomas Insel, again, director of the National Institute of Mental Health, he's keenly aware that this DSM is now becoming a joke and an embarrassment. And what he says in 2013 is this, last quote, okay, from him is, the NIMH will be reorienting its research away from DSM categories. He says this in 2013, basically saying, we're not going to fund, here at the NIMH, you come to us with a study that's based on the DSM diagnosis, we're not going to fund it. Okay, so this is a shocking kind of turnaround that's happened. So what do you have happening here? Take a look at the aggregate here. 4 basic areas. The corruption of psychiatry by drug companies, all these now being reported by mainstream media, corruption by psychiatry by drug companies, the chemical and brain imbalance theory of mental illness, their most important theory here, being described now as an urban legend by insider establishment psychiatrists. You've got the effectiveness of their major drugs being called into question here. You've got their diagnostic manual being run from by the NIMH director and once insider establishment psychiatrists. So when you put them all together, it's almost perplexing why anybody is taking establishment psychiatry seriously. So this brings me to part 2 of what I want to talk about. Why is that? Why are we taking this institution seriously? Why is society? Well, the easy answer to that, okay, I think, has to do with the fact that a lot of people have talked about this. It's about drug company money. They tell, drug company can prop up anything. And I say that there's some truth to that. But I think that it's a mistake to view that as the entire answer. I think the entire answer actually is much darker than that. All right? I think there's aspects of our society itself, our culture, that are oppressive, that are dehumanizing, that are alienating, and that it needs something out there, some institution to cover up the adverse effects of society itself, to be able to cover up, to discount, to marginalize, to invalidate people who are not adjusting to it, to discount people who are rebelling against it. There's something that's required, and psychiatry, certainly by its pathologizing, fits that role, all right? And what I want to do is give you a few examples here of aspects of society, what I mean by that. But I've learned from experience talking about this a little bit, that if I spend too much time in this area of what's oppressive about society, it just depresses everybody too much. So I will try to limit how much I talk about here. One huge area it's important for us to be honest about is our schools, okay? Which for not every school and not for every kid, but for the majority, studies will show, and I'll get to, are oppressive, dehumanizing places that turn kids off to education. Okay, I'm in a private practice for over 30 years, and it's routine for me to talk to parents, who tell me their kids were once excited about schooling when they were in kindergarten, first grade, and their lights go out in their eyes as they get into it, all right? And the research, they say, backs this up. There was a Gallup poll, 2013, that was called a school cliff. You could Google it. And it showed that for each year, kids went to school. They hated school more and more. That was the cliff, okay? No surprise. How did this happen? Well, there's a National Endowment of Arts review of 40 studies that came out a few years ago. And what they said was that there is a relationship between kids losing their love of reading for pleasure and the amount of school that they go to. So it declines. Their love of reading, their reading for pleasure declines with each year of school. There was a study this year that came out that said, and there's been other studies like this before that show this reading for pleasure declines to the extent that kids feel coerced. They're being forced to read stuff they hate. Okay? Coercion is a turnoff for a lot of things in life. And it is for education, but that's part and parcel of our educational system. So schooling, what ends up happening to a lot of these kids who are, in pain, I routinely get parents bring a kid into my, teenagers, sometimes younger, I see, but a lot of teenagers over the year, they tell me, my kid tested real high on IQ, they once loved learning, loved being interested in things, and now they're not going to, they don't want to go to school anymore. They're missing classes, they're not doing their homework, they're not studying for tests, they're getting Fs, maybe in one or two classes, maybe all their classes. And you spend some time talking to these kids, and routinely the major reason is school's oppressive for them. It's oppressively boring, okay? It's oppressive that they're forced to study things they have no interest in, sometimes be in classes with teachers they believe hate them, and they begin to hate. These are things that happen. But what ends up happening to these kids, okay, with their pain of school, depending on their temperament, depending on their personality, some of these kids who just take their pain and just blow off school, they get labeled, stamped ADHD. If they're a little obnoxious about it, they get labeled ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. Some of them are getting called substance abusers. Some of these kids I talk to get labeled being depressed or anxiety. These are kids I talk to, they're the more kind of polite souls who tell me, Bruce, is this what life is all about? You have to do things you really hate, or they're going to kill you, they're going to punish you, you won't be able to survive. Is that what life is? That's what it seems like school is. And so they get labeled, and some of these kids get suicidal over that. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not saying the only pain in young people's lives is school. Okay, sometimes kids can come from pretty oppressive families, there's bullying, there's a lot of things that are tough about being childhood, but school can be a hugely oppressive thing for a lot of people out there, for a lot of kids. So again, you have this role of psychiatry, in our society, by labeling people with mental illness, just drugging them, it's like, let's cover up the fact that there's something deeply wrong with this institution for a lot of kids out there. All right, so I got to tell you though, when I go through this thing, I got to be clear, I am not trashing teachers, because I get more positive email from teachers than any other profession out there, especially after that last book, that Get Up, Stand Up book came out. It's an activism book. They'll tell me, Bruce, school's not just oppressive for kids. It is oppressive for us who are teachers there. We have to spend all day in these authoritarian atmospheres teaching to these tests, doing something we don't believe in just to hold on to our job. Okay? And they're in pain about their job now. Many of them are wanting to quit even. And so this brings me to a whole other area where psychiatry covers up the adverse effects, which is our work world. Again, Gallup poll, 2013, 70% of Americans hate what they do for a living. Okay, they're disengaged for it. They don't want. Why is that? Take a look at U.S. Department of Labor statistics of what are most people doing for a living. They're not, most of these things, the kind of things that young people sit around and say, this is what I want to do when I grow up. They're things people are doing just for a paycheck. And often a bad paycheck, okay? So top 10 jobs in America. Number one job in America, 4.5 million jobs, retail sales clerks. Now, maybe a couple of them are having a good time, making a good paycheck, but not the ones I talk to. What else in the top 10? 2.5, 3 million cashiers, janitors, fast food service workers. There's only one job in the whole top 10 that requires a degree. Nursing. A lot of nurses in America. But talk to nurses. I talk to them all the time. How many of them are happy? They're still talking. They like their patient care when they get a chance. I see head shakes in the audience. But what are they having to worry about? Oppressive, bureaucratic hospitals, doctors. There's a survey that came out a couple of years ago. 9 out of 10 doctors said they would not recommend to friends and family to go into healthcare. Again, a lot of them like healthcare, but you've got giant hospitals buying their practices, so they don't even have autonomy and they can't even practice medicine the way they want. So across the board here, for not all Americans, I mean, some people are having a good time going to work. LeBron James, I'm sure, is having a good time. There's a few people out there, I'm not saying everybody, but the majority of people, work life is oppressive, it's alienating. And so, again, often, that when I see people, that's the source of their depression, anxiety, and you just have, again, psychiatry, a useful role in this kind of society, maintaining the status quo. Let's just pathologize these behaviors, call them symptoms, and medicate them away. A few other areas, okay, that psychiatry is really useful for in this society. For the rest of medicine, psychiatry is very useful, and I'll tell you why. As many of you know here, the massive amounts of most of medication, psychiatric medication, is not being prescribed by psychiatry. Okay, it's being prescribed by other doctors, okay, other primary care doctors. So why? What happens there? Well, I talk to pediatricians, and pediatricians say, like, well, why should I ship over to psychiatrists? They do these medical managements where they talk to some kid for 10 minutes, get symptoms, and write a script. I can do the same thing. You know, and so what you end up happening, because psychiatry and their med management validates this as being okay, you have, instead of 40 to 50,000 American psychiatrists prescribing psychiatric drugs, you have 400 to 500,000 primary care doctors prescribing these drugs. And that's one of the big reasons why you have this explosion of people on these. Other aspects of medicine, okay, that utilize psychiatry. Often in this assembly line medicine that we have, where doctors don't have enough time, or they don't have enough wherewithal, enough training to figure out real, legitimate, biological, organic problems, they can't figure out what's going on. And so I've talked to many people whose lives have been ruined because they get shipped over to psychiatry. And once the psychiatrists, they say, like, well, if you've been cleared, quotes, cleared by the rest of medicine, you must then just be a head case. You must be a somatoform or somaticizer, okay? And boom, this kind of thing can ruin these people's lives, all right? The military utilizes psychiatry in huge ways, okay? And we have in America today, we have one out of 6 soldiers in the military. This is Navy Times reported this a few years back on some kind of psychiatric drug. We have almost 2 million veterans on some kind of one or more psychiatric drug. And again, what's happening there? You've got young men, young women going off to these wars, many of them in my lifetime, by the way, and many of them, you know, not with clear rationales, okay? Let's just put it that way. But clearly they're getting traumatized being in these wars, and they have problems. So what's the easy, simple, cheapest way of convincing yourself as an institution and a society that you're taking care of these folks, rather than trying to reintegrate them into their families, get them meaningful work, do all those kinds of things? Just how do you get them out of the clinic tour as quick as possible? Write them a script, okay? Label them with a diagnosis. If you take a look at almost every part of American society that has been, every population, every group that's been thrown overboard, been really not cared about, and there can be potentially disruptive because of that, there's, you know, psychiatric drugs. This is why you have an $18 billion a year, as of a few years ago, antipsychotic industry. Why it's become the largest grossing class of drugs in America really has to do with the fact that it's not very few of them are being prescribed to actually people who've been diagnosed with psychotic. It's just being used to control populations. So you've got people certainly in prisons in America. We've got this giant prison industrial complex where you've got prisons for profit, where you've got situations where giant corporations make more money to the extent that more of us are incarcerated. Pretty insane, right? But that's the way it is. And you know, if you want to cut costs, you have non-union prison guards rather than prison guards, even cheaper than non-union prison guards. are using antipsychotic drugs. And so talk to people who've been released from prisons and jails. They'll tell you how rampant that is. Nursing homes, it's widely used. Foster care kids, a whole population, I hate to say, embarrassed to say about our society, has been thrown overboard and not cared about. Okay? There are huge numbers on these. As I said in the movie, they're 1 out of 4. Okay? So, populations are happening all the time. And when I started out, this one population I'm going to finish up with in this section never even existed. But it is growing to millions and millions of people in huge pain, depressed, anxious because of their huge student loan debt. I see folks, not just in their 20s now, in their 30s, 40s, millions of folks telling me they've got $400, $600, $800 a month student loan payments. They don't even want to think about it. It's so depressing for them. And here it is. They go to doctor's office, they report these symptoms, and they're just like labeled, as they have some mental illness, okay? And they're medicated. As opposed to, what would happen many years ago, maybe, would be people realizing we're being thrown overboard by this society. You guys, baby boomers, when you went to public universities, you didn't accrue any student loan debt. Most of the rest of the world is not accruing student loan debt. This is pain caused by societal policy here, and we're being labeled with depression and anxiety because of this stuff. And instead of these people becoming politicized and organizing, they're being pathologized. Okay? So I can go on and on. Again, I know when I go through this stuff, I hope I haven't depressed you all too much. I'm going to stop there, I promise, because I'm sure you all have other examples in your head. But, my point is here, this is why getting the truth out there alone about this loss of credibility in psychiatry, why that's been important, necessary in our activism, but it's not been enough, okay? It's like we need more is required, all right? Because of the problems that we're up against. So what I want to finish up with is what else can we do besides getting the truth out there, all right? And again, I want to be clear that the truth is necessary. I don't want to diss it here. It's been necessary, but it turns out not sufficient. We've done a pretty good job. People who are mental health professional dissidents, who are ex-patients, journalists, filmmakers, they've done a pretty good job getting the word out there. To now it's like I said, mainstream media is even reporting it. People like the NIMH director is distancing themselves from psychiatry. You've got psychiatrists, apostates. So we've done a pretty good job. We've also done a pretty good job, and we've got to continue in creating alternatives. That's another huge part of activism, creating alternatives. And by alternatives, I certainly mean places. We've got a great history of that in this movement, from R.D. Lang and Kingsley Hall to, I mentioned Laura Motion, Soteria House, to open dialogue, to real deal peer support is hugely important. And it's really important that the general public hear about this. I write all the time, and the first question you'll always get is, it's easy to trash psychiatry. What do you have instead? And there's a lot instead. They just haven't heard about it. Which is why it's also real important, the alternative media is really important. And I'm part of that. And I got to tell you, I write for mainstream media, independent media, but what happens to me, like I said, I write for the Huffington Post. But they have a medical review board at the Huffington Post that censors a lot of what I write. Okay? Now, a lot of that will get published in places like Truthout or Alternet or Salon. I write for those places too. But even some of the stuff I write for them, they're a little wary of, okay? And it turns out there's one place that I can only be sure that will publish stuff, which is Mad in America, madinamerica.com. So, for example, there's a piece I did a while back called Anti-Authoritarians and Schizophrenia. They were the only place who ran it, but not because a lack of people wanted to read it. I mean, in that small kind of website, it's already been viewed by over 60,000 people, and there's been other pieces that I put on Mad in America that have gone viral. Over 250,000 people have looked at it. So it's not because the mainstream media is hip to the fact that they know how many readers are going to read certain things. They're just afraid of certain things. That's why it's real important to have alternative media like Mad in America. The last thing I want to talk about, well, maybe last or next to last, is an area that I think in our activism and our advocacy we don't really talk about enough. And so what I want to do is just kind of sort of stimulate, maybe even provoke discussion with some of my opinions about this, because I think it's hugely important in terms of advocacy and political activism. And this is the area of coalitions and alliances. So The first question is, why do we need in our movement coalitions and alliances? Well, the answer is that the way things happen in America politically, if you want to keep things or change things, control things, one way to do it is a boatload of money. You know, if you have a boatload of money, wheelbarrows, and you go to Congress and you bribe them, campaign donations. If you do that, you can make things happen. But in this movement, we'll never have a lot of money. We don't have some giant industrial complex behind us here. So instead of, if you don't have that, you need to have a large base. You need to have an energized base. This is politics 101. So coalitions and alliances are really important in terms of expanding a base, energizing a base. So the next question that I think about a lot is like, well, who do you form alliances and coalitions with, and who maybe you don't? And again, this question, the answer to this, I think, is nuanced somewhat, depending on the situation. We can talk about later in the discussion period if you want. But generally, for me, I do not think that the single criteria should be, does an individual or a group out there hate psychiatry or hate psychiatric drugs? And I tell you why, because there are what I consider authoritarian people out there, authoritarian groups that don't hate psychiatry, hate psychiatrics. There are authoritarian behaviorists. There are authoritarian religious groups that they're only so glad to knock off psychiatry so they can replace it and give their own brand of authoritarianism. And I'm not real crazy about helping those people out. Okay, so for me, the reason why on a basic level, why I would feel uncomfortable about forming alliances and coalitions with these authoritarian groups, even though they might dislike some aspects of psychiatry that I dislike, is because on one level you lose certain kind of political currency, credibility out there in the world. But also, too, on another level, basic activism is what fuels our activism. Again, we don't have money in our movement, so we rely on energy. And our energy is fueled by morality, okay? But it's also fueled by this anti-authoritarianism. It's an energy, this anti-authoritarianism. And what ends up happening, is if you form a coalition with an authoritarian group who might agree with you on a few things, you're going to lose your energy. At least that's my experience. But again, we could talk about this more after if you're interested. The other question is like, who do you think we should form alliances and coalitions with? And so for me, the answer to that is the criteria doesn't necessarily mean they hate psychiatry. They may know nothing of our movement, okay? They may not even know this movement exists until we talk to them about it. But what they're about, other people that we could form coalitions and alliances with, is that they're essentially anti-authoritarian people. They're essentially people who are comfortable questioning whether an authority is legitimate or not legitimate before taking it seriously. They're comfortable challenging and resisting illegitimate authorities, speaking truth to power, whatever you want to call it. All right? And so there's a lot of people out there like that. Really, there are. I'll give you one example, all right? That's a much larger movement that has a lot of parallels to this movement that I'm talking about here, which is the school reform movement, a big movement, okay? Some of these people call themselves school reformers. Some of them are deschoolers, unschoolers, homeschoolers, and there's a lot of parallels in their anti-authoritarianism to the people in this mental health reform movement. In terms of politically, you have people who are, some folks who are libertarian anti-authoritarians, you have people who are maybe left communitarian anti-authoritarians. We don't agree on everything politically, but there's an alliance and coalition that they form on the area that it's obvious to them that it's a bad idea to try to coerce and oppress people, to try to get them to be something that they're not. And it's clear to them, it makes sense to them, that if you do that, you're going to create these kind of mental health so-called symptoms. So that's an easy group to form alliances and coalitions with. Other groups out there, for me, are and this is probably the majority of America I'm going to talk to about right now, there are any group of people whose society has used, at some point in American history, that society has used psychiatry to try to get them to comply, to conform, to fit better on the assembly line. So we're certainly talking about Native Americans. Okay, certainly there's a long history of how mental health professionals have been used to make that happen. We're certainly talking about African Americans. This last piece that I did that you can see on my website that got published in Alternate, I go through a lot of these different groups. were certainly, as I mentioned before, talking about gay Americans up until the early 1970s, gay homosexuality is a mental illness. We're certainly also, we're talking about assertive women throughout history have been declared as mentally ill. So a huge part, I think, of what our advocacy and activism has to be about, what I try to do anyways, is to reacquaint people from this group, especially those groups of people who don't really feel oppressed by psychiatry anymore, to reacquaint them that this has been the historic role of psychiatry in the society, and maybe you're not getting oppressed anymore, but there are other people the same thing is happening to. Certainly it still goes on for people with lived experience. It now goes on in a big, big way for young people, for teenagers, for children, for toddlers. This kind of thing is happening. Certainly for foster children, okay? This kind of thing is happening. So what I want to do here, okay, is wrap up here, and I'd be glad to, in the discussion period, if anybody's interested, give you some examples of me going to other anti-authoritarian groups and connecting with them and forming alliances with them about this movement. But what I want to just finish up with is one last area, a couple of minutes on one last area that may be the most important aspect of our advocacy and activism. And that's the area, for me, that I would call transcending fear. Modeling, transcending fear, modeling not being manipulated into being fearful. And this is hugely important because if you take a look at, again, what do authoritarians do? I mean, what is the fuel of authoritarianism has to do with fear. That fuels authoritarianism. And that's why throughout history, and still goes on today, authoritarians try to trump up fear. That's what they try to do. Whether they're trying to get people to fight in a war, they'll get people scared of, in my day, when I was young, Gulf of Tonkin incidents that never occurred. More recently, weapons of mass destruction that never were. We can go on and on with these ways to trump up fear for people who are authoritarians to manipulate people to do what they want to do. And you have that in mental health too, okay? If you could trump up enough fear with people, for example, who've been diagnosed with serious mental illness, with psychoses, with schizophrenia, if you could trump up fear with them, you could tell people, try to convince people that these people are more likely to commit violence. When we know for over 5 decades, I've been looking at research that shows this is not true. You're just making this stuff up. But if you could get people afraid of that, you could put through all kind of coercive legislation, like the Murphy Bill and whatever other kind of legislation. If you got people afraid, they're going to comply with authorities. All right, so a huge thing that what we have to do has to do with modeling that we're not going to be manipulated into being fearful. And this is on a personal helper level. Whether we're working with people who are behaving in maybe strange ways, unusual ways, strange emotional states, to be able to transcend our fear and to move into like maybe understanding and actually even caring. Also on a bigger political level, transcending fear certainly means when you're around abusive authorities who are trying to intimidate you, is to be able to, as the saying goes, speak truth to power. Okay? And so the good thing is what ends up happening is to the extent that people can model transcending their fears, this is highly valuable in terms of all activism because it's so energizing. This is why authoritarians throughout history and throughout modern day are terrified of the energy of anti-authoritarianism because they know it's contagious. It's especially when you have a depressed authoritarian society that has no energy. When they see some of that energy that goes on, it's contagious, and that's how activism, that's how movements take off, and they can take off in a hurry. All right, so in finishing, what I just want to review, of course we have to keep getting the truth out there. The truth alone hasn't been sufficient, but it's still necessary. We have to keep getting alternatives out there. They have been hugely helpful, hugely powerful in terms of our activism, our advocacy. We have to think, use our wisdom and get the discussion going in terms of alliances and coalitions, what makes sense, what doesn't, and continue to transcend our fears. Okay, thank you. Thank you.